Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar organized by Funds for NGOs. Today's topic is strategic partnerships in a changing and aid landscape from donor dependence to collaborative growth. I am Anutma and I'm here to facilitate this session. First of all, I want to thank each one of you for joining us. This webinar will run for 60 minutes, which includes 45 minutes of presentation, followed by a 15 minutes of Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A option on your webinar screen to post your questions, and we will respond to them during the Q&A session. Let's begin with webinar objectives. To ensure participants understand the importance of collaboration in partnerships, including donor dependency versus collaboration, participants can understand the types of partnerships for nonprofits and their benefits. To provide practical steps and examples for how to build successful strategic partnerships. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the video section of the Funds for NGOs premium website. And now allow me to introduce today's trainer, Claire O'Donnell. Claire is a fundraising specialist consultant, having worked in business development for international and national non-governmental organizations for over 10 years. Claire has a master's in international development and diplomacy in Geneva, Switzerland, as well as graduate certificate in educational technology from Vancouver, Canada. Claire has built fundraising systems in every part of the business development cycle, from corporate engagement to grants management and compliance systems, as well as supported organization in unrestricted and institutional fundraising and innovative program design. Claire is the executive director and founder of Bright Consulting Limited, supporting nonprofits in their fundraising efforts across Asian and European donor markets. Now, I kindly request Claire to lead the session and share screen. Thank you.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Anu, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to the Strategic Partnerships in a Changing Aid Landscape webinar. As Anu said, my name is Claire O'Donnell. I am a fundraising consultant for nonprofits and the executive director of my own consulting firm in Asia, and I'm very happy to be guiding you through the webinar today. So some of the webinar objectives were already outlined, but I would like to go over a little bit more in detail what we're going to cover today, and kind of the sections we're going to cover when it comes to strategic partnerships. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about donor dependency in a changing landscape. And this includes some kind of pointers of what's happening in the changing aid landscape nowadays. And then we're going to go more into collaborative growth. So kind of the difference between strategic versus transactional donor relationships and some examples there. And then also talking about the types of partnerships that nonprofits can have and their benefits. So that's from corporate, nonprofit, government, and academia. So kind of what those partnerships look like, and what are the things that can happen within those strategic partnerships. And then we'll go on to just a framework for building effective partnerships, which kind of follows a 4-step approach that at Bright Consulting, we like to call identify, engage, structure, and sustain. So I'll be walking you through the kind of building blocks of that framework and describing some theoretical examples for how to kind of build a successful strategic partnership. And then we'll end off on some key do's and don'ts to build successful strategic partnerships. So what are some of the good things to do? Maybe what are some of the things to kind of avoid when looking for successful strategic partnerships? So coming on to kind of the first overall subject today, which is donor dependency in a changing aid landscape. I would really like to start off firstly with kind of describing a little bit about the current context, since we all know the aid landscape has really been changing within the current context today, and then going a little bit more into kind of what this looks like for fundraising, so why this matters, and kind of from a partnership lens as well, where we're kind of veering off to in terms of kind of more classic fundraising mechanisms to a lot more kind of strategic partnerships lenses when it comes to our donors as well. So we all know that in 2025, there has been a significant decline of traditional aid. OECD actually within 2025, kind of mid this year, projected a 9 to 17% drop in net official development assistance in 2025. And this was already following quite a significant decline of 9% in 2024. So the reason why this percentage is quite varied is because there has been a lot of, kind of difficulties in the aid sector, from a lot of the dismantling of US aid to some of the other governments that have kind of doubled down on some of the commitments that they've made within their ODA assistance and spending. That's kind of contributed to a percentage figure that's a bit varied right now, but hopefully some of those statistics will come out in early 2026. This, however, is really going to affect a lot of least developed countries. So a lot of countries that are kind of still developing or still within that particular phase could see as high as a 13 to 25% fall in ODA, which is provided usually in 2025. So this is obviously, you can see this is quite a steep kind of decline that's going to happen for a lot of like lower and middle income countries, more especially, which kind of means that a lot more support obviously is needed from nonprofits, even though the finances are kind of decreasing. So this kind of leads on to the second point here of the fact that we're all having to shift our perspectives of what nonprofits look like, and especially what partnerships and what fundraising looks like within the world today. You can see across some of the major kind of conferences and forums in the aid world, UNGA and Skull World Forum, that they've really been echoing that there's kind of these major shifts that are happening in 2025 with the aid sector. And we're really having to rethink a lot of the way that we engage with donors, and a lot of the fundraising that we kind of used to do, which was kind of at an all-time high 2020 to 2023, of course, and just having that be like a really sharp decline now. So kind of coming on to my next point, there is a lot of donor fatigue, I would say, this year. A lot of organizations that still are willing to give are receiving a lot of excessive requests. And of course, a lot of nonprofits are looking to kind of make up a lot of the funding that's been lost within the sector nowadays. So they're knocking on a lot of doors and a lot of foundations and donors' doors, trying to see how they can do that. But I think there's a lot of different strategies and ways that we can also engage donors in kind of a very new way. So I think in terms of more of a positive spin of that, there is a rise in a lot more mutually beneficial fundraising formats, which is kind of the backdrop. A lot of what our session will be about today about strategic partnerships is that you're just seeing that kind of more mutually beneficial piece come in between donors, between nonprofits, and between different kind of partnerships like coalitions that are starting to form. So, for example, in the fundraising space, there's more mechanisms of blended finance, more loans. We are seeing a lot more companies kind of investing in corporate social responsibility mechanisms, not just employee giving, but also kind of maybe match funding that they're doing off of donation drives. And then also environmental, social, and governance investing is also happening, and kind of reporting around that ESG investing as well. So all that to say is that, it really has kind of changed the landscape. But again, to my point earlier, we're going to have to shift a lot of our perspective of what fundraising means for nonprofits moving forward. Another important thing to note within the current context is that there still is significant growth in local philanthropy efforts. So the kind of localization piece that we had been talking about for years has really been sped up as of this year because of everything that's been changing. So donors that are located in a region are really starting to prioritize even further and giving even more within their region or their country, or about the same amount. So they're trying to localize a lot of their efforts so that their finances can be spread a little bit more around. That's not to say for every foundation and donor, there's a lot that are still global, but we definitely are seeing a little bit more of an increase in localization, which is important to note when you're thinking about strategic partnerships, because a lot of strategic partnerships or coalitions and stuff seem to be kind of forming at a very local level, either regional or country specific. So when it comes to donor dependency, this was quite a common thing that was happening before a lot of these aid cuts had occurred. In terms of a definition, donor dependency refers to transactional, short-term, and very one-way support, which is traditionally also where donor dependency is where nonprofits kind of depend on a single source income from one specific donor to fund all their projects and activities. Traditionally, institutional fundraising, since it was high over the last 10 years before this steep decline, nonprofits could really highly depend on one donor source, maybe for about 30 to 40% of their income. A lot of this had to do with a project by project basis. So a lot of institutional funders typically would fund a particular project with a set of deliverables and then be done with that project, or maybe extend that project beyond a certain period. But given the drastic funding cuts that have started to happen, we can't really rely on one single funding source on that donor dependency that we used to see. I would say now that there's a lot more diversifying that's starting to happen in fundraising, like some of the examples given on the other slides, where nonprofits are starting to discover what loans are about, or thinking about impact investing or angel investing with different types of individual donors. So definitely things are kind of changing in how we think of donor dependency, and that's starting to become a little bit less of a trend that we're seeing with nonprofits moving forward. In terms of a tip, we do need to increase our collaboration in a lot of numerous ways. So kind of stemming away from that donor dependency is about forming those mutually beneficial relationships and partnerships with your funders and partners, and seeking that collaboration to grow financially as well as organizationally, which I'm going to be walking through a little bit more in the next section. This really represents a much more holistic view that we're seeing nowadays towards how we approach fundraising. And I just want to leave you with a little bit of a very recent quote here that you can see from UNGA 2025, the WHO Director General. The aid cuts come on top of the already chronic domestic underinvestment and aid dependency in developing countries. So there has been a large history of aid dependency and kind of underinvestment in that area, which is an opportunity to shake off the yoke of aid dependency and embrace a new era of sovereignty, self-reliance, and solidarity. So coming into our next section, collaborative growth, you might be wondering some ways and how you can go about discovering these strategic partnerships and some of the building blocks with how to build successful partnerships, which I'll be walking you through a bit today. Since this is kind of a new area, new space as we're changing with the changing era as well. So I wanted to start off with a bit of a definition of strategic versus transactional donor relationships, which was said a bit before within the slides before. But here's some building blocks of what a strategic donor relationship looks like versus a transactional one. Firstly, a strategic donor relationship is really mutually beneficial. Transactional ones benefits one side only, typically the nonprofit or the donor. I would say in large part the nonprofit, because there is financial gain that is being had to be able to enable them to carry out their projects and the deliverables successfully. But in strategic donor relationships, there's a lot more of kind of a mutually beneficial relationship that's included in that. So it might be more communications and advertising that benefits the donor as well as benefits the nonprofit to kind of get their message out there. And that's a huge part of the donor relationship. There's also financial components that go into that. It might also be engaging employees, like employee giving. It might be giving a loan and then being able to give that back from a nonprofit to a financial institution. So you're starting to see a lot more kind of in a strategic donor relationship, a mutually beneficial situation rather than, you know, a project being paid for and then being done with a set of deliverables. Another thing to note is that strategic donor relationships typically involve more innovative results frameworks, while transactional donor relationships are very deliverable based. So in terms of a transactional relationship, you would have to complete XYZ deliverables in an amount of years. And then that's pretty much it. While in strategic donor relationships that we're seeing more nowadays, you start to see more innovative results frameworks. So this basically means a lot of kind of results and deliverables that build off of one each other. So it might not necessarily be for the length of the project you're done, and then you start a new project with a different results framework. It might be that you have an innovative results framework that, you know, includes comms, that includes fundraising in different areas within your nonprofit expertise, but then also has results that really last over a long period of time, which kind of strategic donor relationships really value that longevity in terms of a relationship and really value being able to see the progress of what your nonprofit can make over time. I would say strategic donor relationships are also slightly more resilient to changes and shocks. And we're starting, of course, we've experienced a lot of that between the COVID pandemic and the changes in the aid sector. A transactional donor relationship stops after the funding is done and deliverables are met. Sometimes it can, you know, you can reapply, but that's usually also having to build onto something new. While strategic donor relationships are often a little bit more resilient because they have those innovative results frameworks that build off of each other and that carry on for a longer amount of time. A strategic donor relationship as well, in a lot of the times, it can be quite wide-reaching, which I think is definitely a benefit on the side for nonprofits. In terms of a transactional donor relationship, it can reach, you have to reach a certain target based on a project. So this might mean you have to produce a few communications deliverables and posting, but that might be it. In a strategic donor relationship, it might be that you can be very innovative in how you start to communicate your results in your partnership. That, of course, is going on for a bit of a longer time, which might reach a wider audience. It could be through videos, it could be through the communities that you're serving, it could be through focus group discussions. So there's a lot of creativity at play with strategic donor relationships. And then finally, strategic donor relationships, as discussed before, really integrates different fundraising strategies and models. While transactional ones is usually money donated in exchange for the project being carried out to term. So giving you examples here of what a strategic versus transactional partnership kind of looks like. A strategic donor relationship or partnership from nonprofit to nonprofit can look like a coalition. And we've seen quite a few coalitions nowadays, and this has obviously been a practice in the id sector for a while. But one example is the Child Fund Alliance, which is a really big global network of 11 child-focused nonprofits that are working together towards supporting millions of children and their families worldwide. So they're working in about 66 countries. They very much promote collaboration and partnership on a very localized level. So you have kind of the 11 bigger nonprofits that are leading the Child Fund Alliance, but they work alternatively with local implementing organizations and communities. They also have a very streamlined communications as one particular alliance and coalition. So they help bridge new partnerships. So a lot of the organizations that are located in developed countries help bridge new partnerships and raise funds for a very single cause, but it goes towards multiple nonprofits. So that's kind of an example of a strategic partnership from a nonprofit to nonprofit level. And we'll go into some other types in a little bit. And in terms of a transactional one, an example is that UNESCO provides competitive short-term research grants to young researchers that funds their work in a specific area. So it funds it for a specific amount of time, it's deliverable based, and then once the research is done, the funding stops. So now I kind of want to come on to some of the types of strategic partnerships instead of the difference between strategic versus transactional. So we're going to go over kind of the 4 different types of strategic partnerships that you can see in the chart here, and I'm going to work my way through each one. The first one is nonprofit to corporate strategic partnerships. So this is really, as we all hear the buzzword corporate social responsibility, has a lot to do with a nonprofit corporate strategic partnership. A lot of good corporate social responsibility initiatives have shared values with the nonprofit. So it's not necessarily just do a donation drive and match the funding, but a lot of kind of more sophisticated CSR initiatives have that shared value. Some of the examples of what this type of strategic partnership looks like is that it could be an in-kind goods exchange. So a lot of corporates nowadays, for example, are donating in-kind goods to nonprofits where they see value. And then basically that's reported back to the corporate. There's a lot of tech companies that donate laptops, that donate cell phones and things like that to basically help enable the work of the nonprofit on the ground. There's also kind of the buzzword of employee engagement, which is quite a popular form of CSR nowadays. This means the potential involvement of an engagement of employees and nonprofits. And this is in exchange for money or for funding drives. So basically doubling that funding, or maybe employees volunteering a certain amount of time within the nonprofit. Maybe the nonprofit as well gives trainings in exchange with employees in exchange for funding too. And then another example is really visibility and funding drives. So there's a lot of, in terms of this types of strategic partnership, there's a lot of visibility to be had. And you know, the value of a corporate here is that they do have a big platform. They often do have something to sell, and they have a big customer base. On top of the fact that they do have the finances. So if you do find ones with a shared value, it can really become a useful strategic partnership in terms of increasing that visibility and what kind of showcasing the kind of work that the nonprofit does within the community, utilizing a certain corporate's shared values or potentially their technology or what they produce. So I've provided an example for each, a theoretical example for each type of strategic partnership. In terms of a nonprofit corporate example, a youth education nonprofit in India, for example, partnered with a tech company, not just for grant funding, but to co-create a digital skills program. So this is the co-creation of a particular program, which you are seeing a lot of kind of corporates start to get involved with that. For example, Microsoft. The company provided hardware, software licenses, and volunteer mentors to work with the nonprofit to co-create the digital skills program. The nonprofit provided access to underserved schools and training expertise. And then the result, for example, was that the program reached 10,000 plus students and became part of the company's long-term strategy. So this is kind of an example of that longevity, that innovative results framework piece, where kind of the nonprofits work then got integrated into kind of a corporate strategy, theoretically. So coming on to the second type of strategic partnership, this is kind of the example given before for strategic versus transactional partnership, but it has to do with nonprofit to nonprofit. So talking about alliances and coalitions. And I would argue that this is kind of one of the strongest strategic partnerships that a lot of nonprofits are starting to make today, because there's a lot of co-funding value that can happen with alliances and coalitions. So alliances or coalitions with other nonprofits work well that have similar goals. Again, it's that mission and value alignment, as well as complementary expertise and shared values. So nonprofits that really have complementary expertise, one nonprofit might be an expert in one particular field and the other in the other, and they can use and pool those resources together to create a succinct project within their shared missions and values is kind of a good way that a lot of strategic partnerships are happening nowadays. Some examples of this, as I mentioned, is the nonprofit to nonprofit strategic partnership can result in applying to open call for proposals together, which is very valuable, especially considering the amount of competition involved in open call for proposals. Being able to pool your resources together really strengthens an application from my experience. It also can involve co-funding drives and campaigns that are hosted together. There's a lot of successful digital campaigns that come out of alliances and coalitions as well, and online fundraising drives that can happen through that. And in terms of collaboration, this also means dialogues, inviting other nonprofits and donors. So maybe focus group discussions, maybe more high-level dialogues that are happening around the shared value or theme for the alliance and coalition is a very strategic way to also go about this type of partnership. And then another thing that you kind of see out of this strategic partnership is knowledge sharing and innovation hubs or working groups. So there are a lot of nonprofit to nonprofit working groups, like the Child Fund Alliance that I said before has working groups within that alliance too, that you're starting to see, and innovation hubs to be able to kind of spark a little bit of innovation between different sets of partners and nonprofits and build on that. So they might be able to kind of refine their innovation and make it appeal to other types of donors. So in terms of another nonprofit to nonprofit example, for example, two environmental NGOs in Southeast Asia recognized they were competing for the same climate adaptation funding, which happens a lot. So it is important in those proposals to check who your competition is. Instead of competing, they decided to form a coalition because their concepts were similar. One of the nonprofits led on policy advocacy, and the other decided to lead on community mobilization. Their joint proposal that they had, instead of submitting two separate proposals for a type of funding, secured larger multi-year donor funding than either could have won alone. It also positioned them together, hopefully, as the project progresses as regional thought leaders. So this is kind of an example that's framed in a different way in terms of a lot of the work that we do regularly at a nonprofit as a proposal. So that is a type of way that you can kind of implement a nonprofit to nonprofit strategic partnership, as well as some of the other examples mentioned on the slide before. So in terms of the third type of strategic partnership, this is public-private partnerships. And we might have heard that particular term, especially when it comes to donors. A very large example of a public-private partnership is the Global Fund. This is usually a partnership that's kind of happening at a level that less involves like local nonprofits and more between private companies and public institutions. But it's very good to kind of be aware of where those public-private partnerships are, because they also do offer a lot of kind of collaboration ways with regional and local nonprofits. So they do like to collaborate depending on what their mission and vision is. So public-private partnerships are usually long-term agreements between private companies and public institutions, like foundations and governments, as well as much larger nonprofits. So again, public-private partnerships are happening on quite a large level. But yeah, it's really good to kind of be aware of where they are, because sometimes they have working groups and they kind of have sub-coalitions within those types of partnerships. It's usually a blend of public and private finances. So private finances that are coming from the company, and then public finances that are coming from the government. So again, a lot of the times you see public-private partnerships that align with the government strategy in terms of how they want to give their assistance and how they want to funnel that out and what they're prioritizing. So you can kind of see a lot of linkages of where government decides to put their public-private partnership, which energy they decide to put in what, depending on which company they collaborate with. In terms of this type of partnership, it can spark innovation from the corporate sector. The corporate sector, of course, has a lot of cutting-edge, innovative ideas that can really impact the kind of infrastructure builds and institutions within a given country. So there is a lot of influence and advocacy that can happen at a public-private partnership level. And again, there are some collaboration ways that come out of that for local nonprofits, but it does happen at quite a high level. So in terms of an example, I tried to kind of craft an example that was a little bit more at a regional level to kind of give you a bit of a flavor of a public-private partnership that's not global. But a health-focused nonprofit in East Africa, a regional one, for example, partnered with the Ministry of Health and a pharmaceutical company to address rural vaccine delivery. A lot of these partnerships were also kind of happening during COVID-19, so during the pandemic time, with pharmaceutical companies, because they had the materials and means to provide the equipment, and then regional nonprofits at the time could distribute quite largely. So the government provided policy backing and logistic support to be able to operate in specific areas. The pharma company contributed cold chain technology, so the type of technology that they needed for rural vaccine delivery. The nonprofit trained community health workers, and to add to this, would likely do some distribution along with the government. And a theoretical result is that vaccination rates rose by 40% in targeted regions. So that could happen. So the last type of strategic partnership is the nonprofit and academic kind of research side of a partnership, which you're definitely seeing some more open call for proposals kind of coming out wanting that nonprofit academic partnership. So these are usually blended projects that, of course, combine research and academia interests into a nonprofit project or mission. You see a lot of universities come out with call for proposals that, kind of want that are inviting applications from other institutions and researchers that are collaborating with nonprofits themselves to fund and to support those types of projects. So a big benefit to this type of strategic partnership is that there's a lot of co-applying to open call for proposals together. I would say you usually see a lot more nonprofit to nonprofit call for proposals, because nonprofits tend to know a lot more nonprofits typically in fundraising spaces. But there is a lot of value to that kind of nonprofit academic side and funding that comes from universities and institutions, if you have access or knowledge to researchers and it aligns to your shared mission and value. There's also, for this type of strategic partnership, there's also knowledge sharing that can happen, of course, between two very different sectors, and innovation hubs or working groups, kind of like in the nonprofit and public-private partnership spaces. And I would say the biggest benefit to this strategic partnership is that it can really move forward the research interests on both parties. So, for example, if a nonprofit has that interest in research or has a vision and mandate on research, then being able to strategically partner with a researcher or academic institution can be really beneficial to move forward those research interests. So a theoretical nonprofit academic example is that a women's rights organization in the Philippines partnered with a university research institute to study the impact of microfinance programs on female entrepreneurs. The university provided data collection and analysis. The nonprofit ensured cultural sensitivity and local connections, which is usually a big piece of a nonprofit's value in a research. And findings influence both government policy and donor priorities. So now we're kind of coming on to the final sections of our webinar today, and that is the framework for building partnerships. So now, after we've looked at a lot of the kind of types of partnerships that can come about for a nonprofit and, the examples, theoretical examples of what that looks like, I wanted to dive into a little bit more of the framework for building partnerships that we have framed here at Bright Consulting, but this hopefully really kind of helps you understand how to build a successful strategic partnership in terms of how to go about it. There's a lot of, people, to me personally, that end up asking questions about how they can go about finding funding and fundraising and building strategic partnerships. So following these kind of safe building blocks is a good way to do so. So I'll outline it here and then go a little bit more into each particular section. But the first building block, similarly to when you're looking for a proposal, is to identify. This basically means to map ecosystem actors, which is really the partners that you're looking at within your particular ecosystem, to see if they align to your mission, your values and goals, and look for complementary strengths within that particular donor or partner that you're looking at. Really looking at the shared values and goals and complementary strengths is the most important in the kind of first identify building block, because a shared mission and value is really what brings a partnership together and keeps it together. So it's creating something that's mutually beneficial, and that always starts at a shared vision. The second building block for a successful strategic partnership is to engage. So start small is the tip that we have here to engage your partnership before formalizing it into something much larger. You want to be able to build that trust with a potential donor or partner before you start to go into something that's much more formalized and much bigger. For example, you could co-design some initiatives together that include shared responsibilities with shared co-funding, funding goals. Maybe there's some cross-posting kind of visibility, shared responsibility that builds your trust and credibility as an organization with that particular partner. The third step you'd want to go into is actually to structure. So this is after you've kind of built that trust and that credibility, and you've been able to build trust amongst that partner, and you're kind of wanting to get into the next phase of engagement with them. Then the third phase would be to really structure and formalize a much larger partnership. A lot of people tend to kind of want to jump in at the identify and engage stage with a large partnership, and maybe that doesn't necessarily work out or pan out. So it's important to remember that to build a strategic partnership, there is kind of good steps to follow. And it does sometimes take some time to be able to build that trust and credibility and formalize something that's a little bit more substantial. So in terms of structure, this is where you start to define clear roles and responsibilities with clear funding goals. So you create partnership agreements to formalize and establish accountability moving forward. This includes focal points. This includes maybe some outcomes. So you can measure your progress and level of effort that you're putting into the partnership with what's been produced or what kind of financial goal you're able to get out of it. And then finally, the last step is sustain. So this is where you usually want to form a strategic partnership for the long haul. There's a longevity aspect to this type of partnership. So sustaining is creating a sustainable partnership where you want to monitor and evaluate your outcomes versus your level of effort. So how much are you putting into this partnership versus what you're getting out of it? This includes regular communication, adapting and renewing your partnerships over time based on successful outcomes. So sometimes you might have to go back a step to structure, to rethink about how you want to move your partnership along if the outcomes aren't necessarily working, and then you can move forward back into the sustain part of your partnership. So I'm going to go through kind of each step in terms of the goal that you would want to have for each step, as well as one particular theoretical example that I'm going to walk through the building blocks, and then kind of the key tip or key takeaway that you can have within each step that hopefully you can, that hopefully will help you with this framework. So in terms of identify, the goal in the identify stage is really to find partners whose missions, values, or expertise align with yours. As I had said before, the mission and the vision is really the first start. So for example, a small climate nonprofit identifies a regional agri-tech company developing low-cost irrigation tools. Both organizations share a goal of improving climate resilience for farmers. The nonprofit recognizes that partnering could help scale community programs and increase impact visibility for the company's CSR efforts. So there's a shared kind of complementary value in what they're looking for and vision. The key takeaway is that you really want to look for alignment of purpose and complementary strengths and not just funding potential. A lot of the times we look at which corporates have a lot of money and could give us a lot of money, but they might not share the same values. They might not see the value in your work. So you might not want to waste your time, and you want to go on to a partnership where there is a shared purpose. They have complementary strengths, and it isn't just about the funding potential. The next step, engage. The goal here is really to build trust and co-design opportunities together, small opportunities to build that trust. So stemming off of the example before, after initial conversations, the nonprofit and the agri-tech company host joint focus group sessions. So kind of a small building trust exercise, so to speak, with farming cooperatives to understand needs. They share insights and agree to co-develop a pilot project that integrates the company's technology into the nonprofit's training model. So the key takeaway here is to really treat the engagement as relationship building, not necessarily negotiating for exactly what you want at that moment in time. So start small and co-create that value early so that when you do come to the next phase, you have a lot of mutual trust built between your partners. The next phase is to structure. So the goal of this one is to really formalize the partnership, the roles, the governance, and deliverables. And you do want to be clear on the governance and the roles and shared responsibilities so things don't get too confusing. So after all of this has happened, kind of stemming off of the example from before, both partners agree to sign a memorandum of understanding, which is a typical strategic partnership practice that outlines responsibilities. The company provides equipment and maintenance training because they like the trainings that happened before. The nonprofit manages field implementation and community outreach. Both share data on adoption and outcomes. So they also agree on a quarterly review process and shared communications plan so they can communicate the work that they're doing and the kind of value that that has within the agri sector. The key takeaway in this step is that there are clear agreements and transparency that can prevent misunderstandings and sustain trust. So if you do have a partnership eventually that doesn't become fully formalized, it becomes really hard to understand who's owning what the complementary strengths are, and what you're initially going for. And a lot of the times the partnership will dissolve because of that. So it's important to make those agreements clear. And then finally, sustain. The goal is to nurture, evaluate, and evolve the partnership over time. So after the first year, the partnership expands into, let's say, a multi-country program. So they start to deliver their trainings, not just in one country, but in others. Both partners jointly publish impact reports, use shared data to improve training, and explore a co-branded funding proposal for regional scale up. So that's kind of when they start to do co-funding together, for example. The key takeaway here could be that long-term success depends on regular reflection, flexibility, and celebrating the results together. So really forming a relationship that's strong. And finally, coming on to the key do's and don'ts in order to build success for a successful partnership. So we talked about the types, we've talked about a little bit more of the framework. So what are the things that we kind of want to do, or what's good practice, so to speak, and what are the things that we maybe want to avoid in successful strategic partnerships? So do's, we've talked about this a lot, is that value exchange. So aligning on mission and values early, starting with that shared purpose and not necessarily starting with the funding ask right away. We want to build that trust and we want to build that credibility. Don't partner just for money. That's usually a common mistake that happens in fundraising, is that we want to go for the organizations that have the biggest funding. But again, it might not align to what we do. So the strategic fit needs to be present with funding as one of the asks in a mutually beneficial partnership. It's not to say there wouldn't be funding there, but it needs to be one of the asks among kind of many asks in a strategic partnership. Do be clear on what each partner brings to the table. So looking for those complementary strengths, like we said before, articulate your contributions that you can make. Can you make contributions as a nonprofit in terms of skills, networking, maybe some co-funding to fund something like a small research piece? And don't assume shared understanding. So avoid really vague agreements or unwritten expectations, as well as misalignments in those strengths and weaknesses in your complementary strengths. That can erode trust quite fast, and eventually a lot of partnerships can dissolve that way. Do invest time in trust building. You do have to invest time into building that particular relationship. Partnerships really grow through transparency, responsiveness, and regular communication. Schedule check-ins to track progress, share updates, and address issues. So keep building the relationship with them, a kind of more personal relationship with them. Don't overpromise on what you can deliver. A lot of the times, maybe we overcommit to some of the things that we put in a mutual partnership agreement. So don't overcommit your team and what you can deliver in the partnership time period. Credibility really does matter. So what you can deliver well, and that's going to be the most important aspect of the partnership. Do stay flexible and adaptive. Again, it is a changing aid sector. And these types of strategic partnerships can really flex, which is the exciting part of these partnerships. But it also means that you as an organization need to stay flexible and adaptive to maybe some of the activities that you initially wanted to do changing a little bit to meet the partnership's needs or vice versa. And finally, don't under review your partnerships. So this is really key with the identify phase. Review your partnerships on what went well, didn't go well, do a little bit of reflection in order to be better informed for future collaboration, and the types of partnerships that you want. So do that internal reflection within your nonprofit and organization to be able to do strategic partnerships a little bit better too, moving forward. And yeah, I'd love to leave you with a few just thought questions, and a thank you. What did you learn from the webinar today? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and opinions. What stuck out to you the most in terms of strategic partnerships and kind of some of the things that we discussed in the building blocks? And have you already started building strategic partnerships into your nonprofit? If yes, how so? Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for insightful presentation. Participants, now we are open for questions, so please send us the questions. The first question we have received is what should be done to obtain a partnership for the preparation of an NGO?
Right. So some of the building blocks that I kind of mentioned before, the framework, is really a good first step to be able to build a partnership, even if it's with an alliance or a coalition in a particular nonprofit. So kind of follow through on the identify, engage, structure, and sustain phases.
Right. Thank you for your input, Claire. The next question is how to achieve a successful partnership with an NGO and some grants in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. Unfortunately, sub-Saharan Africa is not necessarily my area of expertise. But in terms of strategic partnerships, again, following the kind of framework and building blocks that I had said before is important. I think as well, typically what you see across Africa is that there are a lot of kind of nonprofit alliance and coalitions, which are very important to kind of form. To be able to present that. So maybe you might want to consider some of the nonprofit type of partnership that was discussed before. And maybe you could also look at some research organizations because there is a lot of university funding that does happen in Africa if you do have a research component to your nonprofit.
Thank you, Claire, for your input. The next question is what do you think is the biggest misconception NGOs have about partnerships with donors or the private sector?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. What do you think is the biggest misconception NGOs have about partnerships with donors or the private sector?
Right, that's a good one. I think that the biggest misconception right now is that these organizations are these organizations have a lot of money. So that strategic alignment, that vision alignment, which I had said a lot in this webinar, is the biggest misconception. They're going to be just because they booked a meeting with me means that they're very interested in my vision and mission as a nonprofit. And I think as nonprofit workers, sometimes we're very passionate about our vision and mission, but that might not necessarily align to what the corporate wants to fund. So doing that particular research beforehand into what their vision and mission is and what kind of nonprofits they fund is really important before you go into an initial conversation with a corporate or potential donor.
Thank you, Claire, for your input. The next question is do you think local partnerships are becoming more valuable than international ones in today's aid landscape?
Very good question. I think there is a lot of value in international partnerships. Again, if that shared mission and vision aligns, But I definitely, I would advise as a fundraiser, I see a lot of value in local partnerships. I see a lot of localization happening, and I see a lot of foundations and organizations that do fund be very interested in that kind of local nonprofit to nonprofit collaboration. I think it can make your work a lot stronger and a lot stronger if you do that together. So I think we are seeing a lot of that kind of localization be the most important piece. And I would say that I would advise that the local partnership building is becoming more important and strategic.
Thank you for your input, Claire. The next question is, how can digital platforms and technology enhance collaborative growth among NGOs and the funders?
Good question. I think it's important to note with a lot of kind of funders nowadays is that digital technology is something that has a lot of money that's being put into it within our sector. So there is a lot of value in terms of being able to do kind of in-kind donations with a corporate and then building a strategic partnership from there for funding as well as for visibility. I think there's a lot of benefits that nonprofits can have as well in terms of using digital resources. So we're starting to see a lot more fundraising drives and campaigns that are happening digitally rather than just happening in person like we saw in the past. So, for example, kind of using crowdfunding campaigns and having another corporate being able to match fund with that has a lot of value. And I think it also is able to kind of spread your visibility and your word as a nonprofit. You're able to kind of spread the word on your mission a lot larger to a bigger audience.
Thank you for your input, Claire. The next question is, what are the key qualities that make a partnership truly strategic rather than just financial?
Question. So some of those things I had kind of mentioned before in strategic versus transactional is that a mutually beneficial partnership is really important. So a lot of strategic partners are looking for something that benefits them equally as it benefits the nonprofit. And that could be co-funding, that could be finance or otherwise. Looking at something that's a lot more innovative and that sustains itself for a longer time than just one particular project. So something proposing a project that builds off of one another. For example, you have an activity that leads to an activity that leads to an activity. And of course, looking at integrating different fundraising strategies and models and kind of wide reaching. So that visibility aspect is important as well in those strategic partnerships.
Thank you, Claire, for your input. The next question is, are there any common mistakes NGOs should avoid when entering in new partnerships?
Yeah, I think maybe in terms of nonprofits not overcommitting versus what you can do. I think once a potential partner is really interested in the work you do and you've built that trust, assuming, I think nonprofits can actually be ones to be able to propose what they can do and what they can't do so that you're not stretching yourself too thin. And if you have kind of built that trust with your partner, then they will accept when you get to that kind of agreement phase, they will accept some of the things that you can do and cannot do. So that is a common mistake that we do see with nonprofits is kind of overcommitting to something and maybe overstretching when there might not be a need to within that strategic partnership if everything else is kind of aligning.
Thank you, Claire, for your input. Dear participants, due to time limitations, we cannot cover all the questions posted here. As now we have reached the end of the webinar, I want to thank each one of you for your active participation. Participants, please take a moment to fill out the feedback form for today's session. Your input is crucial in helping us to improve. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to contact us at support@fundsforngos.org. The feedback form will appear on your screen in a moment. I want to thank you, Claire, for the insightful presentation in the webinar. And to all the participants, we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you.